My name is Janusz. I'm a neuropsychologist with the Extraordinary Kids Clinic at Children's Hospital, Colorado, and I'm going to speak with you now about some interventions for learning disorders in X and Y chromosome variations and what does the research show us really works. First, I'm going to start with a definition of what is a learning disorder or a learning disability. This is a very technical definition of what a learning disorder is, so let's break that down. A learning disorder is neurodevelopmental. That means it's related to how the brain develops. It is a disorder, which means it's a disruption of function. So in whatever area we're talking about, the kids are not performing at a level we would expect. It is biological in origin, which means it's part of who the person is. It's not caused by an outside source or anything that anyone did. And is related to academic functioning. So either reading, spelling, math, or writing skills. So essentially a learning disorder or a learning disability is a child who is not functioning in a way we would expect in an academic area. So I do want to discuss terms a little bit because I think there's a lot of terms and terminology out there used for learning disabilities, and I want to make sure that there's an understanding of what they all mean. The first thing I want to talk about is dyslexia versus reading disorder. And lots of times when I talk with the families, they say, well, my child has dyslexia. Does that mean they also have a reading disorder? Is that the same thing? And as researchers and people who really look very specifically at reading, they think of dyslexia as deficits in really the very fine-tuned components needed in reading. So things like phonological awareness versus a reading disorder, which is a little bit more of a broad-based category. So kids who have reading problems, but also problems in reading-related skills like reading comprehension. Usually, though, most of the time, these two things are used interchangeably. Dyslexia means reading disorder. They're both the same thing. And I'll be using them pretty interchangeably in this talk. The same sort of happens for dysgraphia and written expression. Is that the same thing or not? These are a little bit different. Usually we think about dysgraphia as a deficit in the physical act of writing, so things, motor skills that affect handwriting, versus written expression, which is your ability to put your thoughts together and put them down on paper. Dyscalculia is a word that is used a little bit less, but just like dyslexia, people think of that as deficits in the very component skills of math, so things like number sense and math facts, versus a math disorder, which is difficulties more in kind of broader math problems. So problems with those math facts, but also math reasoning, higher level math skills. So when we think about academic development over time, in any skill that we're talking about, we need to develop foundational skills first. And then over time, we develop these more complex skills. So if we think about reading, we know that foundational skills of reading include things like decoding and phonological skills and fluency in reading, which then lay the groundwork for more complex reading comprehension abilities. Writing is a little bit different. Spelling is certainly a foundational skill for writing, but we know to be a good writer and to have good written expression, it involves a lot more than that. And we'll talk about that as well later on. And then in math, we see things like number sense, math facts, basic calculation skills, then lay the groundwork for more complex math reasoning skills. When we think about interventions across any of these abilities, we think that there are going to be interventions that we're going to do that focus more on those foundational skills, and then interventions that focus more on the complex skills, regardless of whether you're looking at reading, writing, or math. So when we think about the essential components of interventions for foundational skills across any of those skills, the first thing that we know is that instruction needs to be explicit. So explicit instruction means that it's very purposeful. We know why we're doing it. We have a plan for how we're doing it, and it consists of very systematic and very structured teaching. We also know that we want interventions to be evidence-based. This means that there's a theory behind it. So we have a theory as to why kids might have reading or math problems, and the intervention has lots of research behind it proving its effectiveness. We also want that instruction to be direct instruction. So as we go through a lot of these strategies, you'll see that many of them are just good teaching strategies, and any kid would benefit from them. But for kids with learning disabilities, that instruction needs to be more direct, either one-on-one or in a small group setting. And then the last thing that we know is that the intervention needs to be intensive. So it needs to happen daily or multiple times a week for it to be effective. Now, thinking about components of interventions from those more complex skills, again, we want explicit instruction. And as you'll see through my talk, this is going to be a theme. all of this instruction that we're doing, we want to be, again, very purposeful and very systematic in how we're going about and doing it. For more complex skills, we're going to use more of an executive functioning approach. And you may have heard our executive functioning talk earlier in the day, but we're going to think about how do we take those tasks and break them down, and how do we teach strategies for approaching these more complex tasks. Again, we're going to think about direct instruction being important, usually as kids get older and more of a small group setting. And then we're going to think about the use of technology and how are we going to use technology to really support these skills. So I'm going to start off by talking about dyslexia. We know that kids with trisomies and tetrasomies and pentasomies are at more risk for these language and reading-based problems. And these are kind of the difficulties that we see kids with dyslexia have. So problems with reading fluently, recognizing words, rhyming, higher level skills like language starts to affect math performance because maybe you can't read the word problem accurately and understanding what you've read. There is a lot of information out there about dyslexia or reading disabilities, and I always like to kind of think through what might be true or not true about this. So let's do a little bit of a true and false here. So reading and writing letters backwards is a sign of dyslexia. I hear this a lot from parents, or you see this a lot in the media, and that's actually not true. So while kids with dyslexia might write letters or numbers backwards, it's not really a sign of dyslexia, and it doesn't predict dyslexia. It's not kind of a component of how we think about dyslexia. Dyslexia doesn't show up until elementary school. Well, that's also in partially false. Now, while we can't really diagnose a reading disorder until a kid is reading, we can see lots of precursors to this in kids in the preschool age. So kids who have delayed language milestones, especially in their expressive language, kids who have difficulty with early academic skills like identifying numbers or letters are all at higher risk for dyslexia. Dyslexia is a vision problem. This was one of the very, very early theories of dyslexia, but that has been proven false many times, that dyslexia is actually not a problem with vision or seeing letters. And then the last one, dyslexia is caused by not reading enough. And I definitely want to debunk this myth. Kids who are biologically predisposed to dyslexia, it doesn't matter how much you read, the dyslexia is still going to potentially be there. So I don't want parents to think that it's something that they did by not reading enough with their kids early on. Dyslexia is not related to not reading enough with your kids. So what is dyslexia then? So the first thing we want to think about is dyslexia is a language-based disorder. So we know that dyslexia is related to inefficiencies in the language centers and the language pathways of our brain. So that's why when we see kids with early language problems, we get concerned about a greater risk for dyslexia later on. It's characterized by difficulties with accurate reading. So when we think about accurate reading, we're thinking about that phoneme awareness. So your ability to understand the relationship between a letter and a sound and how you blend those sounds together. And then problems with having fluency in that reading and spelling. So reading, to be a good reader, these skills have to be very automatic. And so when they're not automatic and we see the disfluency, we also start to think about dyslexia. So what are the key components of dyslexia then? So one is this phonological awareness. And for a long time, theories of reading really focused on this phonological awareness, that this is the kind of the main deficit. But now we've moved towards what they call kind of a multimodal theory of dyslexia, where we know that it's not just the phonological awareness, but we also know that this rapid naming is very important. Rapid naming looks at how fluent or automatic our skills are. So when I see kids for assessment, I test rapid naming by doing things like read these colors as fast as you can, or tell me the names of these objects as fast as you can. So they're tasks that are pretty simple, and I just want to see how automatic is that for them. And we've seen kids with dyslexia that these kind of skills that should be very fluent and automatic aren't. So this rapid naming automaticity piece is also very important for reading. And then the third piece that goes along with this is verbal short-term memory. So we know also to be a good reader, you have to be able to keep information in your mind. When we think about intervention for reading, we think about, again, those two levels, the foundational skills and the more complex skills. The first foundational skills happen mostly between kinder and about third to second grade. We historically always thought of this as third grade, but for those of you who have kids, we know that academic demands are getting higher and higher at younger ages. So many times now we're thinking about these foundational skills as happening between kindergarten and second grade level, when kids are really learning to read. And then in that third and fourth grade level on, things switch to where you're really having to read to learn, right? So you're having to get information from text and incorporate that into your knowledge. Focusing on the foundational skills, we're going to focus on those things like decoding and the fluency. And then the strategies we're going to work on for the higher level skills are really teaching these strategies of reading and listening comprehension. So what are the essential components of those foundational reading and spelling interventions? And I'm going to include spelling in here because we know that these interventions work for kids who have both kind of foundational reading and spelling difficulties. So again, I mentioned you're going to see this on every slide, explicit instruction. We want this to be structured teaching focused on phonics, that sound letter relationship, as well as on decoding skills. So how can I look at a word, understand how to break those sounds apart, understand how to blend those sounds together? We want this to be evidence-based. One example of an evidence-based reading program is Orton-Gillingham. There are a lot of Orton-Gillingham is a very structured phonics-based program, and there's a lot of programs that are based on Orton-Gillingham, and those are the kind of programs we want to see used. We want this to be one-on-one or small group, daily or multiple times per week. And we also want to think about starting these interventions early, even before a dyslexia diagnosis. And this is really important. Lots of times schools, especially for younger kids, want to take sort of a wait and see approach, right? Well, let's give it another 6 months. Let's give it another year and see how these reading skills develop. We know that early language problems are highly correlated with dyslexia and later reading difficulties. And we know that these kids are at higher risk for reading deficits. So there's no reason to sort of take a wait and see approach until dyslexia is actually diagnosed. Let's start those interventions early when we start to see some of those early red flags. And I also just want to highlight these. If you start to read any of the research on this online or anywhere, you'll see that the two things that people highlight over and over again are explicit and intensive. These instructions need to be explicit, structured, and then, daily or multiple times a week for them really to be effective. So what are the essential components of reading strategy interventions? So again, we want them to be explicit, but now we're going to be taking this more executive functioning approach where we're going to think about how do we really teach kids how to approach text. So this is just an example of a collaborative reading strategy where we want to have kids really think through, how do I take this text and make it into something manageable that I can really learn and understand from? We also want to think about promoting generalization. So lots of times I see that these interventions happen in literacy or English classes, which is great, but then we're not teaching kids how to use these strategies in history class or in a science class where you're also potentially reading a lot of text. So you really want to not just teach these strategies, but teach them how to use these strategies across different types of settings. And then we want to use technology, and especially as kids start to get older, doing a lot of intensive intervention is certainly going to make kids better readers, but they're still going to potentially be slower readers, or the reading is going to be effortful. And so if they're in 7th grade and having to read a novel, using an audiobook and listening to that can really be helpful in terms of just getting them through the material. So thinking about using that kind of technology, or also things that will read to them. So for example, using readers that will read to them a math problem to make sure they're not getting caught up in the language of it. Okay, I'm going to move on to talking about disorders of written expression. And so this is really the kids who have problems getting all that information out on paper, putting it together in an organized way, using appropriate grammar, these kinds of things. And when we think about writing really, when you break it down, is a very complex task and requires a lot of things that need to be going on. So first is you have to have pretty good language skills. So you need to make sure that your writing is using the right grammar, the right syntax, and you have to have a good vocabulary. Good writers use a lot of different words and varied vocabulary. The other big piece is knowledge. And so this is knowledge not only of the content that you're writing about, but also the type of writing. So you need to know, how am I going to write differently for a creative writing story versus a persuasive essay? And then finally, writing involves a lot of executive functioning skills. You've got to plan a strategy, you got to organize what you're going to say, and you've got to do some self-monitoring. So you've got to be able to go back, edit your work, those kinds of things. So what do we do to help with writing? Again, we're going to make it explicit, and we're going to use this executive functioning approach. And this is an example of one that's evidence-based, where again, we're teaching kids, how do we take this task, this big task, and breaking it down into something smaller? So this strategy actually taught kids specific strategies to use for either a creative writing story or persuasive essay. It very explicitly taught how to use words to make things more interesting. It taught kids how to go back and edit and monitor their essays, and also used a peer mediation process where kids would help each other and teach each other tricks and strategies to use while writing. We also want to provide templates for writing. So how can we help kids give kids more structure for their writing? These can be very simple. You've probably seen your kids use some of these visual webs where you have a topic in the middle and then the details that go all around the topic. They can become more complex. We're helping to think about, how many details do you need, or how many sentences to make up a paragraph? And then also using different templates for different types of writing. And then again, we want to think about our use of technology. So sometimes for kids who have to write big essays, just doing that writing part is really labor intensive. And so we want to think about using voice to text software. For many kids, it's easier to just verbally get all that information out, and then you can go back and edit it later. There's also lots of different kinds of technology and programs. Grammarly is an example of one that will go and kind of check your work for grammar problems and things like that. Okay, and lastly, I'm going to talk about math disorders. Math disorders are probably are sort of less research. We know a little bit less about math disorders than we do reading, and kind of what is the best way to intervene. But these are some of the ideas that we have about that. So we know that math disorders can look like trouble counting, trouble doing calculations, those things, but also those higher level math skills and how math impacts other things like telling time, counting money, reading charts and graphs. When people started looking at math, they used the same kind of model that people who were doing research in reading did. And so as we know, reading has this difficulty with kind of that basic building block of reading of phonics. So they looked at problems with number sense. So number sense is things like being able to count and understanding the relationship between numbers, understanding things like 7 is smaller than 9. So sort of that sense of numeracy. And so they looked at difficulties there, and they found that certainly kids with math deficits have problems in that basic number sense. But they also have problems with working memory, so keeping information in mind, and they also have slower processing speed. And now what was interesting is that while in the reading disability model, all those things are kind of equal, what we found in math is that working memory and processing speed actually are bigger contributors to math deficits than actual number sense problems. So this is really interesting, but when we look at interventions, we find that to make math better, you actually have to work on math. So you might sometimes see, if you're researching interventions like computerized programs that say, oh, we're going to help working memory skills. Well, that makes working memory better, but that doesn't always translate into being better at math. Okay, so what are we going to do for math interventions? Again, we're going to make it explicit. We're going to focus on those very specific sub-skills of math. So math facts, math calculations, those kinds of things. So we want interventions to be evidence-based. Now, there's a little bit less information out there about specific programs that have a lot of evidence behind them for math disabilities, but we know the components that are important for interventions. The most important is that things are very explicit and procedurally clear. So many schools nowadays have moved on to using more conceptual ways of teaching math. And if you've ever done math with your kids at home, you might have seen this. So if you're taking a problem like 113 plus 256, you're breaking that down into 100 and 10 and 3 and 250 and 6, and you're kind of adding those together, as opposed to kind of the old school way that I learned to do math, where you bring it down and carry the 1 and things like that. These more conceptual ways of doing it, while for kids without math disabilities are good ways to think about math, for kids with math disabilities, they're very confusing. They're too abstract. They have too many parts to them. And so we want to kind of go back to the old-fashioned way of teaching math, where you're doing things in a very structured way to get math problems done. Using things like pictures, manipulatives, talking through the process can also be really very helpful. Again, we want one-on-one and multiple times a week or daily intervention. Then the other piece I want to talk about is math anxiety. Because a lot of the research, when we look at math disabilities, also talks about the impact of math anxiety. And one of the things that they talk a lot about is adults sort of transmitting their own anxieties about math onto kids. So whether that's teachers or parents. And there was one really interesting study that found that kids whose parents helped them with their math homework were actually more anxious about math than kids whose parents didn't help them. And while I'm not saying you shouldn't help your kids with math, it is, I think, sort of showing that sometimes without us even realizing it, we transmit our own anxieties about some things onto our kids. And so thinking about, being very mindful of that if you're doing math with your kids, but also thinking about ways just to reduce anxiety in general and thinking about how that might be impacting their math development as well. Okay. Math reasoning strategies, again, it's going to be explicit. We're taking that executive functioning approach. And again, we're taking these big math concepts and breaking them into the smallest components possible. And that is really going to be that step-by-step strategy, that step-by-step teaching is going to be super important, as well as providing a lot of support while they're going through more conceptual math things. Lots of times we think about helping kids develop these routines and making kind of a recipe book for math problems. And so this is my recipe for doing long division. This is my recipe for doing multi-digit multiplication. And that way they have this very structured way and these routines they can easily fall back on. And then lastly, as with the other ones, how are we going to use technology? And so as kids get older, they may understand the math process or how to conceptually to do it, but we want to make sure they're not making mistakes in the calculation part. And so thinking about using a calculator becomes a very appropriate accommodation as kids progress through school. One thing to really think about is how to be an educated consumer. So if you were to Google, reading disability interventions, all sorts of things pop up for that. So how do we think about that in a way to find things that we know are going to work for our kids? The things you want to look for is that they're based on theory and that they're empirically validated through research. So we want to look for things that are well grounded in the research and have a lot of research for evidence. We also want to make sure that the research that's done is not completed by the developers, right? So we want this to be other groups, other researchers have taken this intervention and looked at it to see if it's effective. There's lots of information online or some organizations online that can help you look at different programs. American Academy of Pediatrics has lots on their website. Cochrane Review also looks at different types of interventions and talks about whether they're theoretically and evidence-based, grounded or not. Things to be careful of or things to avoid. Any things that say they're sort of brain-based or have this unfocused neuroscience claim, we're going to increase brain functioning or things like that. Things that say they're going to cure multiple learning disorders. First of all, we're not curing anything, right? We're improving skills and we're giving strategies. But also, as we saw, all these learning disabilities come from different places. So if a strategy is saying, well, we can cure your math and your reading disabilities, we know that that's functionally not sort of how this all works. You also want to make sure that they're supported, or you'll see that they're supported by anecdotes. So you'll go to their website and there's just lots of happy people who say they've done the program, or by their own studies is some another red flag. And then lots of times these programs that tend to be very, very expensive. And, I'll be honest, if you work with one-on-one with a tutor who's well-trained in Orton Gillingham approaches, it's not going to be cheap. But a lot of these more controversial therapies that we see make really big claims. So in 10 computer sessions, we'll improve your kid's reading and it's $5,000. So things to really, those are kind of the red flags to think about when you're thinking about what kind of interventions for your kids' academics that you want to look at. This is a list of some of these more controversial therapies. I do want to make a comment about motor therapies. Clearly, occupational therapy and physical therapy are very important for motor problems, handwriting included. But if we think about motor therapies to improve dyslexia, that is not a founded therapy for dyslexia. And all of these therapies either do not have much evidence behind them or have evidence behind them that they actually are not effective. So when we think about these things or when you see these therapies, I kind of want you to think twice about their effectiveness. And just keeping in mind for all of these things, if you're looking for therapies, if something sounds too good to be true, it probably is. So in terms of parent resources, the Learning Disabilities Association of America is a great resource. There's lots of information on their website, including a podcast that they do to talk about how to help kids and adults with learning disabilities. And then also your own state, this is the logo for our Learning Disability Association here in Colorado, but lots of local organizations can have, again, helpful information on their websites, but also in-person conferences for families to attend.